In a quiet corner of the galaxy, far beyond the reach of Earth's bustling cities and crowded satellites, humanity's most advanced deep space observatory hummed softly in the void. It was called Eyes of Eternity, stationed near the edge of the solar system where light from distant stars barely reached. Its job was simple yet profound: to listen for whispers from the cosmos, signals that might hint at life beyond Earth. On a chilly night in late December, Dr. Ilara Voss sat hunched over her workstation inside the observatory. Her fingers danced across the keyboard as she analyzed data streaming in from the array of telescopes surrounding her. She had spent years waiting for something extraordinary, some clue that humanity wasn't alone in the vastness of space. But so far, all she'd found were echoes of dead stars and static-filled silence. That changed at exactly 23:47 hours. A sharp beep cut through the monotony, startling her. On her screen, a series of strange patterns began to form, a signal unlike anything she'd ever seen before. At first, she thought it was interference, maybe a glitch in the equipment, or even radiation from a nearby asteroid belt. But as the pattern repeated itself with eerie precision, she realized this was no accident. This was deliberate. Her heart raced as she zoomed in on the source. The signal came from a star system billions of miles away, one that hadn't been explored because it was too remote, too dangerous. Could it be? She whispered to herself, her voice trembling with excitement. Ilara quickly ran the signal through several decoding algorithms. Hours passed, but finally, fragments of meaning emerged. They weren't words, at least not in any human language, but symbols and coordinates etched into the transmission like a map. Embedded within them was a single phrase, repeated over and over: "They come. Prepare." The message sent chills down her spine. Who were they? And what did they mean by prepare? Was this a warning, a threat, or perhaps an invitation? Before she could dive deeper, another anomaly appeared on her monitors. Gravitational waves rippled outward from the same region of space, suggesting movement, something massive shifting positions. Whatever, or whoever, had sent the signal wasn't just sitting idle. They were coming closer. Ilara immediately alerted her superiors back on Earth. Within minutes, top scientists and military officials convened in virtual meetings, debating whether the signal was genuine or a natural phenomenon misinterpreted. Some argued it was best to ignore it, fearing it might attract unwanted attention. Others insisted they couldn't turn away now. It could be humanity's first real chance at contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. As the arguments raged on, Ilara stared out the observatory window at the endless expanse of stars. For the first time in her career, she felt both awe and dread. Whoever had sent the signal knew how to reach Earth, and if their message was accurate, they weren't alone either. Something else was out there, moving toward them. The signal from the distant star system had sparked both hope and fear across Earth. Governments scrambled to respond, and within days, a hastily assembled fleet was prepared for humanity's first-ever mission into uncharted territory. The flagship of this expedition was the Solstice, a sleek vessel armed with the latest technology and led by Captain Ryland Cortez, a seasoned officer known for his calm demeanor under pressure. Accompanying him were scientists, engineers, and Dr. Ilara Voss herself, who insisted on joining the mission to ensure her findings weren't misinterpreted. As the fleet departed Earth, millions watched live broadcasts of the launch, their faces filled with equal parts excitement and apprehension. Humanity was stepping boldly into the unknown, but no one could predict what awaited them. Weeks passed as the fleet traveled through the vast emptiness of space. Finally, they reached the coordinates embedded in the mysterious signal. What they found there was not what anyone expected. Instead of a thriving alien civilization, or even signs of life, they discovered ruins, massive structures floating eerily around a dying star. The remnants looked ancient, like the skeletal remains of some long-forgotten empire. There were no lights, no movement, only silence. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Dr. Voss as she studied the ruins through the ship's scanners. "If someone sent that signal, Where are they? Before anyone could answer, alarms blared throughout the solstice. On the main view screen, dozens of strange ships emerged from hyperspace, surrounding the fleet in moments. These vessels were unlike anything humanity had ever seen, biomechanical hybrids that seemed part machine, part living organism. Their surfaces shimmered with an iridescent glow, and tendrils of energy pulsed along their hulls like veins. "Captain, they're hailing us," shouted one of the crew members. Cortez nodded sharply. "Open a channel." A distorted voice crackled over the comms, speaking in guttural tones that sounded more like growls than words. The translator system struggled to process it, but fragments came through. "Intruders. Leave. Now." "They think we're invaders," whispered Dr. Voss, her eyes wide with panic. "They don't know we're responding to their signal." Before Cortez could attempt communication, the biomechanical ships opened fire without warning. Bright beams of energy lashed out, striking the human fleet with devastating precision. Shields flared and collapsed under the assault, leaving several smaller vessels crippled. Chaos erupted aboard the Solstice as crew members scrambled to retaliate, but their weapons proved ineffective against the advanced technology of the attackers. "These aren't just ships. They're alive," yelled one of the engineers, pointing at readings showing self-repairing hulls and adaptive defenses. It was as if the vessels themselves were sentient, reacting instinctively to every move made by the humans. Despite their best efforts, the fleet was overwhelmed. One by one, the ships fell silent, either destroyed or forced to retreat. Captain Cortez ordered the Solstice to pull back, narrowly avoiding destruction as the enemy fleet disappeared back into hyperspace as quickly as they had arrived. Back aboard the damaged flagship, tension hung thick in the air. Dr. Voss stared at the empty space where the biomechanical ships had vanished, her mind racing. "That wasn't first contact," she murmured bitterly. "That was a massacre." Cortez clenched his fists, frustration etched on his face. "Whoever, or whatever, they are, they didn't give us a chance to explain ourselves. We need answers before we try again, or next time, none of us might come back." As the battered fleet limped toward Earth, questions swirled among the crew. Were these beings truly hostile? Or had something gone horribly wrong in translation? Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. Humanity's journey into the stars had begun with violence instead of peace, and the cost of failure would be unimaginable. The battered fleet returned to Earth, limping through the atmosphere like wounded birds. News of the disastrous encounter spread quickly, plunging humanity into a mix of fear and outrage. Governments convened emergency sessions, debating whether to retaliate or retreat entirely from the stars. The public demanded answers, but none were forthcoming, until a mysterious figure emerged from the shadows. Cal Arden was not a name many recognized at first. A rogue scientist with a reputation for bending rules, he had spent decades working on the fringes of human exploration. When rumors surfaced that he might hold vital information about the biomechanical attackers, he was summoned to a classified meeting in a secure underground facility. Flanked by armed guards, Cale entered the room wearing a smirk that suggested he knew more than anyone else. "You've been fighting blind," Cale said bluntly as he took his seat across from Captain Ryland Cortez and Dr. Ilara Voss. "Those ships you encountered, they're not just machines. They belong to the Deathworlders." "The Deathworlders?" Cortez asked sharply, leaning forward. "What are you talking about?" Cale leaned back, crossing his arms. "They're survivors. Nomads, really. Their homeworld was destroyed centuries ago, not by war, but by something far worse. Something they call the Vorax." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Think of it as a parasitic hive mind. An entity that consumes civilizations, turning them into extensions of itself. The Deathworlders escaped, but they've been running ever since." Dr. Voss frowned, her mind racing. "If they're survivors, why did they attack us without warning?" "Because they're desperate," Cale replied. "Every moment they spend in one place is a risk. To them, outsiders mean danger. They don't have time to ask questions. They shoot first and assume everyone's an enemy until proven otherwise. Cortez rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. So what do we do now? If they see us as a threat, how can we possibly work together? Kale pulled out a small device from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. It was a data drive, glowing faintly with green light. This contains everything I salvaged from a Deathworlder ship years ago. I studied their tech, their language, their culture. If we play our cards right, we might be able to convince them we're not a threat, and maybe even allies against the Vorax. Ilara picked up the drive cautiously, examining it. Why are you helping us now? You've kept this hidden all these years. Kale hesitated, his usual confidence wavering slightly. Because I made a mistake. When I found that wreckage near Saturn, I thought I could use their technology to advance humanity, but tinkering with it only brought trouble. Now, seeing what happened out there, he gestured vaguely toward the sky. I realize we can't face the Vorax alone. Neither can the Deathworlders. We need each other. Captain Cortez exchanged a glance with Dr. Voss. Despite Kel's questionable past, his knowledge was undeniable and potentially invaluable. After a long silence, Cortez nodded. All right, Kel. You're in. But if you betray us, you'll regret it. As Kel smirked and settled into his new role, Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that his motivations ran deeper than he let on. Still, she knew they had no choice but to trust him. For now, together, they began decoding the data on the drive, uncovering fragments of the Deathworlders' history and hints at their current plight. One thing became clear. The signal they'd received wasn't just a warning. It was a cry for help. And if humanity wanted to survive its first brush with interstellar conflict, they would need to answer that call before it was too late. Inside a dimly lit laboratory deep beneath Earth's surface, Dr. Ilara Voss and Kel Arden worked tirelessly to unravel the secrets hidden within the data drive. The room was cluttered with holographic displays, blinking monitors, and stacks of technical manuals spread across every available surface. Outside, tensions ran high as governments debated their next move. But here, time seemed to stand still, each second devoted to piecing together fragments of knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and extinction. Kale leaned over a console, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he decrypted layer upon layer of alien code. His voice broke the silence. These Deathworlders, they're not just warriors. They were explorers once, like us. Their civilization thrived before the Vorax corrupted them. Ilara glanced at him, her brow furrowed in concentration. So they've been fighting this parasite for centuries. Longer, Kel replied grimly. Centuries turned into millennia. Every victory came at a cost. They lost their homeworld, their culture, even parts of themselves. That's why their ships are biomechanical. It's adaptation born out of necessity. As they delved deeper, more details emerged. Fragments of text revealed that the Deathworlders had developed advanced technology to combat the Vorax. But it wasn't enough. The parasite evolved faster than they could adapt, forcing them to flee constantly. The coordinates embedded in the signal pointed to a rendezvous point, a last-ditch effort to gather allies before the Vorax caught up to them. But there was something else buried in the data, a chilling detail that sent shivers down Ilara's spine. Kale, she said softly, pointing at a string of symbols on one of the screens. What does this mean? Kale squinted at the display, then swore under his breath. It's a countdown. A countdown. Captain Cortez, who had been observing quietly from the corner, stepped forward. To what? To when the Vorax will arrive, Kale explained, his tone grave. They're using the signal to warn anyone who can hear it. If we don't act soon, we'll be facing them alone. And trust me, you don't want that. Ilara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She turned back to the data, determined to find anything that might give humanity an edge. Hours passed as they sifted through fragmented logs and schematics, piecing together the Deathworlders' strategy against the Vorax. One particular discovery stood out: a vulnerability in the parasite's neural network. They found a way to disrupt the hive mind, Ilara announced excitedly, her eyes lighting up. If we could replicate this method, we might have a chance to weaken the Vorax. But replicating it won't be easy, Kale interjected. Their tech is far beyond ours. Even if we understand the theory, building something functional will take time, and resources we may not have. Cortez crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. Time is exactly what we don't have. If the Deathworlders think we're useless, they'll leave us behind, or worse, see us as expendable. Ilara nodded slowly. Then we need to prove our worth. We need to show them we're capable of contributing, not just surviving. Over the next few days, the team worked around the clock, reverse engineering the Deathworlder designs while preparing for another attempt at communication. Cal's expertise proved invaluable, though his methods often raised eyebrows. He pushed boundaries, cutting corners where others hesitated, driven by an almost obsessive determination to succeed. Meanwhile, Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that Cal's urgency stemmed from more than just duty. There were moments when he stared at the data, his face unreadable, as if wrestling with memories or regrets he refused to share. Still, she focused on the task at hand, knowing they couldn't afford distractions. Finally, after countless sleepless nights, they had a breakthrough. A prototype device capable of emitting frequencies designed to disrupt the Vorax's neural pathways. It was crude compared to the Deathworlders' sleek technology, but it worked, at least in simulations. "We're ready," Ilara declared, exhaustion evident in her voice, but resolve burning in her eyes. "Now we just need to get close enough to use it." Cortez gave a curt nod. "Then let's hope the Deathworlders are willing to listen this time. Because if they aren't..." He didn't finish the sentence. No one needed him to. The stage was set for humanity's next gamble, a risky mission to bridge the gap between two species teetering on the brink of annihilation. But as Ilara looked at the prototype device glowing faintly on the table, she allowed herself a sliver of hope. For the first time since the signal arrived, they had a plan. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The plan was as bold as it was dangerous. Armed with the prototype device and Cal's stolen knowledge of Deathworlder technology, a small task force prepared to infiltrate the biomechanical fleet. Captain Ryland Cortez handpicked his crew for the mission. Dr. Ilara Voss, whose expertise in alien languages would be crucial. Cal Arden, whose insights into Deathworlder systems were unmatched, and a squad of elite soldiers trained for high-stakes operations. Their goal was clear: find a way to communicate with the Deathworlders and convince them that humanity could be an ally, not a threat. Their vessel, Shadowstrike, was unlike anything humanity had built before. Designed by Cal using salvaged Deathworlder tech, it blended stealth with speed, its surface coated in a shimmering alloy that mimicked the biomechanical ships. To any scanner, it would appear as just another fragment of debris drifting through space, a ghost among stars. As they approached the Deathworlder fleet, tension filled the cramped confines of Shadowstrike. The air felt heavy, charged with anticipation and fear. On the main view screen, the massive biomechanical ships loomed like sleeping predators, their tendrils pulsing faintly with energy. It was hard to believe these constructs were alive, yet every movement seemed deliberate, almost sentient. "We're entering their perimeter," Cortez announced, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Everyone, stay sharp." Cal sat at the controls, his hands moving deftly over the interface he'd designed. "I'm masking our energy signature now. If we're lucky, they won't even notice us." Ilara clutched the edge of her seat, staring at the screen. "What if we're not lucky?" "Then we fight," one of the soldiers muttered grimly from behind her. For several agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The ship drifted silently through the void, weaving between larger vessels that dwarfed Shadowstrike. Then, without warning, alarms blared throughout the cabin. A red light flashed on the console. "They've detected us." Kale shouted, his fingers flying across the controls. Someone must have noticed an anomaly. Before anyone could react, a swarm of smaller drone-like ships peeled away from the nearest biomechanical vessel, hurtling toward them. Cortez barked orders, and the soldiers scrambled to man the defenses. But Kale wasn't panicking. He smirked as he activated a decoy signal embedded in the ship's system. "Watch this," he said, pressing a button. Instantly, a holographic projection burst forth from Shadow Strike, creating the illusion of multiple ships splitting off in different directions. The drones hesitated, confused by the sudden multiplication of targets. "Nice trick," Cortez admitted grudgingly, "but it won't hold them forever." "No, but it'll buy us time," Kale replied, already plotting a course deeper into the fleet. With the drones distracted, Shadow Strike slipped past the outer defenses and docked directly onto the flagship, a colossal structure that pulsed with ominous energy. Once aboard, the team moved cautiously through narrow corridors lined with pulsating veins of light. Every step echoed eerily, as though the ship itself were alive and watching them. They encountered no resistance, at least not immediately. Instead, they found themselves face to face with Commander Zirak, the stoic leader of the Deathworlders. Zirak towered over them, his armor fused seamlessly with organic components that glowed faintly beneath the dim lighting. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned each member of the team, lingering longest on Kale. When he spoke, his voice resonated like rolling thunder. "You dare trespass on my vessel?" Cortez stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We mean no harm. We've come to help." Zirak's expression didn't change. "Help? You attacked us first." "That was a misunderstanding," Ilara interjected quickly. She held up the prototype device, its faint glow catching Zirak's attention. "This is proof. We know about the Vorax and how to fight them." For a moment, the room fell silent. Zirak studied the device, then turned his piercing gaze back to the humans. "Prove your worth," he said finally, "or leave while you still can." It wasn't trust, but it was a start. As the team exchanged wary glances, Ilara felt a flicker of hope. Convincing the Deathworlders wouldn't be easy, but they had been given a chance, and in the vastness of space, sometimes a chance was all anyone needed to survive. Inside the flagship's stark, metallic chamber, Commander Zirak stood towering over the human delegation. His presence was overwhelming. Part machine, part living organism, his every movement seemed to ripple with latent power. The room itself felt alive, pulsing faintly with bioluminescent veins that lined the walls and ceiling, casting an eerie glow over the tense standoff. Dr. Ilara Voss took a cautious step forward, clutching the prototype device tightly in her hands. "We know about the Vorax," she began, her voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in her chest. "And we've built something that might help you fight them." Zirak's gaze shifted to the device, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing, studying it as though weighing its potential against centuries of failure. Finally, he spoke, his deep voice echoing like distant thunder. "You are fragile creatures. What makes you think your creation can stand against the Vorax?" Ilara hesitated but pressed on. "Because we're not alone anymore. Together, we have a chance. Alone, neither of us will survive." The words hung heavy in the air. Kale Arden, standing slightly behind her, chimed in. "She's right. Your tech is advanced, but even you can't adapt fast enough to keep ahead of the Vorax. This device disrupts their neural network. It weakens them. If we combine our knowledge, we might actually stop them." Zirak turned his piercing eyes to Kale, recognition flickering briefly across his face. You've studied us before." It wasn't a question, but an accusation. Kale met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, I salvaged pieces of your ships after one of your skirmishes near Saturn. I learned what I could because I knew humanity would need allies someday. Now that day has come." For a long moment, Zirak simply stared at him, as if searching for lies or deception. Then, unexpectedly, his stance softened ever so slightly. "You risked much to bring this here." "Why?" "Because we don't want to end up like you," Cortez answered firmly, stepping beside Ilara. "Running from death, losing everything. We're not asking for trust. We're offering a partnership, a way out." Zirak let out a low growl, almost a sigh, and turned away, pacing slowly across the chamber. The humans exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they'd pushed too far or struck a nerve. But when Zirak finally stopped and faced them again, there was a new intensity in his eyes, one of reluctant respect. "I will consider your offer," he said. "But first, you must prove yourselves worthy." Over the next few days, the humans were given limited access to parts of the flagship. They worked alongside Deathworlder engineers, sharing data and refining the prototype under Zirak's watchful eye. At first, interactions were stiff and guarded, marked by mutual suspicion. Yet, as time passed, small bonds began to form. Ilara found herself drawn to Zirak during these exchanges. Despite his imposing demeanor, she sensed a deep sorrow beneath his hardened exterior, a grief born of loss and survival. One evening, while analyzing energy readings together, she ventured a personal question. "What happened to your homeworld?" she asked softly. Zirak paused, his glowing eyes dimming slightly. "It burned," he replied after a long silence. "The Vorax consumed it, leaving only ashes and memories. My people became wanderers, fighting to stay alive while carrying the weight of what we lost." Ilara nodded slowly, understanding dawning within her. "That's why you fight so fiercely, not just to survive, but to protect whatever remains." Zirak regarded her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Perhaps you understand more than I thought." Meanwhile, Captain Cortez earned the respect of the Deathworlder warriors through tactical exercises designed to test their compatibility in combat. In simulated scenarios, he demonstrated quick thinking and adaptability, traits that resonated deeply with the battle-hardened nomads. By the end of one particularly grueling session, a Deathworlder commander named Vera approached him. "You fight well for someone so fragile," she remarked, her tone grudgingly approving. Cortez allowed himself a brief smile. Desperation sharpens the blade. Yet, not everyone was convinced. Kale grew increasingly obsessed with replicating Deathworlder technology, spending hours poring over schematics and arguing with engineers about improvements. His single-minded focus raised concerns among the others, especially Ilara, who noticed how often he dismissed ethical considerations in favor of results. "This isn't just about winning," she warned him one night as they reviewed progress reports. "If we lose ourselves in the process, we're no better than the Vorax." Kale glanced at her sharply. "Survival isn't pretty, Ilara. Sometimes you have to do whatever it takes." As tensions simmered beneath the surface, alliances began to solidify. Humanity and the Deathworlders had taken their first steps toward cooperation, but trust remained fragile, hanging precariously between hope and doubt. And somewhere beyond the stars, the Vorax continued their relentless advance, oblivious to the fragile coalition forming to oppose them. The fragile alliance between humanity and the Deathworlders was beginning to take shape. Progress on the prototype device had accelerated, with both sides contributing their strengths. Human ingenuity blending with Deathworlder biomechanical expertise. The atmosphere aboard the flagship shifted subtly. Conversations became less guarded, gestures more cooperative. For the first time since their disastrous first encounter, there was a glimmer of hope that survival might be possible for both species. But beneath this tentative harmony, cracks were forming. Kel Arden had always been an enigma, his motives shrouded in secrecy. While others focused on refining the prototype, Kale spent long hours alone in the engineering bay, poring over classified data stolen from Earth's military archives. His obsession with Deathworlder technology bordered on fanaticism, and it wasn't long before his actions drew suspicion. One evening, as Dr. Ilara Voss reviewed schematics with Commander Zirak, she noticed something unusual, a faint discrepancy in the energy readings of the prototype. Frowning, she cross-referenced the data against earlier simulations. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured, tapping rapidly at her console. "These fluctuations, they shouldn't be here." Zirak leaned closer, his glowing eyes narrowing. "What do you see?" Before Ilara could answer, alarms blared throughout the chamber. Red warning lights flashed as the flagship systems detected unauthorized activity. A holographic display flickered to life, revealing streams of encrypted Earth military strategies being uploaded directly into the Deathworlders mainframe. "It's Kel," Cortez growled, storming into the room, with 2 soldiers trailing behind him. "He's feeding them classified intel." Ilara felt her stomach drop. Why would he do this? "We're trying to build trust, not sabotage it." Zirek's expression darkened. He turned to one of his commanders. "Find him. Now." Within minutes, Kale was dragged into the chamber, his face pale but defiant. "You don't understand," he shouted, struggling against the soldiers holding him. "I did this for us, for humanity. They needed proof we're valuable allies." "Proof?" Cortez snapped, stepping forward. "You betrayed us. Do you have any idea what this looks like to them?" Cal's voice rose, trembling with desperation. "They weren't going to trust us unless we gave them something concrete. I thought if they saw our military capabilities, they'd realize we're worth keeping around. They already trusted us enough to let us stay." Ilara shot back, anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "Your actions jeopardize everything we've worked for." Zirak held up a hand, silencing the argument. His gaze locked onto Kale, cold and unyielding. "This is not how alliances are forged. Your deception proves you cannot be trusted." "No," Kale pleaded, his voice cracking. "You don't understand what's at stake. If the Vorax come, and they will, we need every advantage we can get. Humanity can't survive without their tech." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was suffocating, broken only by the steady hum of the ship's organic systems. Then Zirak turned to his warriors. "Confine him. All humans are restricted to quarters until further notice." As Cal was hauled away, shouting protests that echoed down the corridors, Ilara sank into a nearby chair, her head in her hands. "This is a disaster," she whispered. "Now they'll think all of us are like him." Cortez clenched his fists, frustration evident on his face. "We didn't ask for this. One man's betrayal shouldn't doom the rest of us." Back on Earth, news of Cal's actions leaked to the public, sparking outrage. Governments demanded immediate withdrawal from the mission, while others called for retaliation against the Deathworlders. Panic spread like wildfire, fueled by fear of alien invasion and distrust of human leadership. Aboard the flagship, Ilara and Cortez braced themselves for the worst. Without Cal's technical expertise, progress on the prototype slowed to a crawl. And worse, the Deathworlders' patience was wearing thin. Zirak summoned them once more, his tone colder than ever. "You have 24 hours to convince me why I should spare your lives," he said. "Fail, and you leave my ship, or join Kale in confinement." As the clock ticked down, Ilara realized their fragile coalition was teetering on the brink of collapse. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild, but she also knew that giving up now meant certain doom. For humanity, for the Deathworlders, and for every living thing in the path of the Vorax. And so, with time running out, she resolved to fight. Not just for survival, but for redemption. The 24-hour deadline loomed over the humans like a shadow. Dr. Ilara Voss and Captain Ryland Cortez worked tirelessly, trying to salvage what remained of their fragile alliance with the Deathworlders. But tensions aboard the flagship were at an all-time high. Every glance from Zirak's warriors carried suspicion, every exchange laced with distrust. It seemed impossible to undo the damage caused by Cal's betrayal. Then, just as hope began to fade, disaster struck, this time from beyond the stars. Alarms screamed through the ship, louder and more urgent than ever before. On the main view screen, a massive fleet emerged from hyperspace, blotting out the distant stars. These ships were unlike anything humanity or the Deathworlders had encountered. Massive organic constructs resembling living fortresses drifted forward, pulsating with sickly green light. Swarms of insectoid drones poured out like locusts, spreading across the void in chaotic waves. "The Vorax," Zirak growled, his voice low and guttural. "They'd found us." Panic rippled through the flagship, but Zirak quickly regained control. Barking orders in his native tongue, he mobilized his forces, preparing for battle. Ilara and Cortez exchanged a glance. This was it. The moment they'd been dreading had arrived. "Commander," Ilara called out, rushing toward Zirak. "Let us help. We can use the prototype device. It might weaken them." Zirak hesitated, his glowing eyes flickering between her and the chaos unfolding outside. Finally, he nodded sharply. "Do it. But if you fail, you die with us." With no time to waste, the human team sprang into action. Under heavy guard, they made their way to Shadow Strike. The cloaked vessel still docked within the flagship. As the Deathworlders engaged the Vorax fleet in a desperate defense, Shadow Strike launched into the fray, slipping past the biomechanical ships and heading straight for the heart of the enemy formation. Inside the cockpit, Cortez gripped the controls tightly, maneuvering through swarms of drones that buzzed around them like angry hornets. "We're not going to last long out here," he muttered, dodging blasts of energy that lit up the darkness. "We don't need long," Ilara replied, clutching the prototype device. "Just enough time to get close." Kale, who had been temporarily released from confinement due to the emergency, sat hunched over a console, frantically recalibrating the device. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked. "I'm boosting its range, but it'll only work if we're inside their central hive mind structure. That means getting dangerously close. And how do you suggest we survive that?" One of the soldiers snapped. Kale didn't look up. "I didn't say we would." As they approached the largest Vorax construct, a monstrous, pulsating entity bristling with tendrils, their ship shuddered under relentless fire. Shields flared and faltered, leaving them exposed. Cortez gritted his teeth, pushing Shadow Strike harder than ever before. "Hold on," he shouted as they dove straight into the belly of the beast. Inside, the environment was nightmarish. Organic walls pulsed around them, dripping with viscous fluid. Strange, writhing creatures cuddled along the surfaces, attacking anything foreign. But at the center lay the source of the hive mind, a massive, throbbing core radiating green energy. "This is it," Kale said, his voice trembling. He activated the device, which hummed to life, emitting a high-pitched frequency that reverberated through the chamber. The core began to destabilize, cracks forming along its surface. "It's working," Ilara exclaimed, relief flooding her face. But the victory came at a cost. The Vorax construct convulsed violently, shaking violently as explosions erupted throughout its body. Trapped inside, escape seemed impossible. "I'll hold them off," Kale said suddenly, standing up. "You two get out of here." "What are you talking about?" Ilara demanded, grabbing his arm. Kale gave her a grim smile. "Redemption isn't free. Someone has to make sure this thing goes down. And I owe you that much." Before she could protest, Kale slammed his hand onto the console, initiating a self-destruct sequence. The ship jolted violently, ejecting the cockpit module with Ilara and Cortez inside. Behind them, the construct imploded in a blinding flash of light. Back aboard the flagship, Zirak watched as the Vorax fleet began to retreat, their formations collapsing into disarray. For the first time, there was a flicker of respect in his eyes, not just for Cal's sacrifice, but for humanity's willingness to fight alongside them. "He redeemed himself," Ilara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "And saved us all," Zirak added quietly. For now, the battle was won, but the war was far from over. The explosion lit up the void like a second sun, its brilliance momentarily blinding everyone aboard the flagship. The shockwave rippled outward, sending debris and fragments of the Vorax fleet spiraling into the darkness. For a few tense seconds, silence reigned, broken only by the faint hum of the Deathworlders' systems recovering from the chaos. Commander Zirak stood on the bridge, his glowing eyes fixed on the viewscreen as the remnants of the Vorax forces retreated into the depths of space. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his posture eased slightly. It was over for now. In the cockpit module ejected from Shadow Strike, Captain Ryland Cortez and Dr. Ilara Voss clung to each other, their hearts pounding with adrenaline and grief. They had made it out alive, but Kel's sacrifice weighed heavily on them both. As their module drifted back toward the flagship, Ilara stared at the fading light of the explosion, tears streaming silently down her face. "He saved us," she whispered hoarsely. "After everything, he gave his life for this." Cortez didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white. "He did what he thought was right," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "And maybe that's all any of us can do." When they were brought aboard the flagship, the mood was somber yet charged with newfound respect. Zirak greeted them personally, his towering figure casting a shadow over the humans. For once, there was no hostility in his gaze, only acknowledgement. "You've proven yourselves," he said simply, his deep voice resonating through the chamber. "Your actions today have earned my trust." Ilara nodded, still clutching the prototype device, the last piece of Kel's work. "We couldn't have done it without him," she replied softly. "His mistakes cost us dearly, but his sacrifice turned the tide." Zirak studied her for a moment, then turned to address his warriors gathered around them. "Today we fought side by side, not as enemies, but as allies. Humanity has shown courage and ingenuity. If we are to survive, such unity must endure." Cheers erupted among the Deathworlders, their biomechanical forms pulsing with renewed energy. For the first time since humanity's arrival, the air felt lighter, hopeful even. Bonds forged in battle began to solidify, bridging the gap between two vastly different species. Over the next few days, efforts shifted toward repairing the damage inflicted during the fight. Both fleets worked together, sharing resources and expertise. Engineers collaborated to restore damaged ships, while scientists analyzed data collected during the encounter with the Vorax. Each discovery reinforced one undeniable truth: the parasite was evolving faster than ever before. "We can't let our guard down," Ilara warned during a joint strategy meeting. "This victory is temporary. The Vorax will adapt, and when they return, they'll be stronger." Zirak nodded grimly. "Then we must prepare, together." Plans were drawn up for a unified defense network, a combination of human innovation and Deathworlder resilience designed to detect and counter future attacks. But more importantly, discussions began about establishing permanent cooperation between the two species. Humanity offered technological advancements, while the Deathworlders shared centuries of survival tactics against the Vorax. Amidst these developments, Ilara found herself reflecting on Kel's final moments. Though his betrayal had nearly destroyed their chances, his ultimate act of redemption had cemented humanity's place alongside the Deathworlders. She vowed to honor his memory, not just as a scientist or strategist, but as someone who had chosen to believe in a better future, even if it meant sacrificing himself to achieve it. As repairs progressed and preparations intensified, Zirak approached Ilara one evening. Standing beside her at the edge of the flagship's observation deck, he gazed out at the stars. "Your kind is fragile," he said after a long pause, "but you possess something rare, a willingness to hope, even in the face of despair." Ilara smiled faintly, following his gaze. "Hope is what keeps us moving forward. Without it, we're no different from the Vorax." Zirak didn't respond immediately, but his silence carried weight. Finally, he spoke again, his tone softer than usual. "Perhaps there is wisdom in that." For the first time since their disastrous first encounter, humanity and the Deathworlders stood united, not just as survivors, but as partners determined to protect the fragile light of life in an increasingly dark universe. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear. Together, they had turned the tide against extinction. Now, they would face whatever came next, not as adversaries, but as allies bound by shared purpose. The aftermath of the battle left an indelible mark on both humanity and the Deathworlders. The once hostile biomechanical fleet now worked alongside human vessels, their combined efforts transforming the remnants of war into tools for survival. Repairs were completed, strategies refined, and plans drawn to fortify against the inevitable return of the Vorax. But beyond the practicalities of rebuilding, something deeper had shifted. A fragile yet undeniable bond had formed between two species that once sought each other as enemies. On the flagship's observation deck, Dr. Ilara Voss stood beside Commander Zirek, gazing out at the stars. The scars of recent battles still lingered in the void, floating debris, damaged ships, and the faint glow of residual energy. But there was also a sense of renewal. Humanity and the Deathworlders had fought side by side, proving that cooperation could turn even the direst odds into triumph. "You've given us hope," Ilara said softly, breaking the silence. "Not just because we survived, but because we did it together." Zirak turned his glowing eyes toward her, his expression thoughtful. "Hope is a dangerous thing," he replied, his voice low and resonant. "It can drive you to greatness, or blind you to reality. But perhaps it is worth the risk." Ilara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. For centuries, the Deathworlders had carried the burden of loss and fear, their lives defined by running from the Vorax. Now, for the first time, they dared to imagine a future where survival wasn't synonymous with despair. Back on Earth, news of the alliance spread cautiously but widely. Governments debated the implications, while citizens grappled with the idea of aligning with beings so vastly different from themselves. Some viewed the Deathworlders with suspicion, fearing their advanced technology and warrior culture. Others saw them as saviors, allies in humanity's darkest hour. Despite the mixed reactions, one truth resonated. Isolation was no longer an option. In a universe teeming with threats, unity was humanity's only path forward. Captain Ryland Cortez returned to Earth briefly to deliver a personal report to global leaders. Standing before a council chamber filled with skeptical faces, he spoke plainly. "We don't have the luxury of fear anymore. The Vorax are coming. And when they do, they won't care about borders or politics. If we want to survive, we need every advantage. And right now, our best chance lies with the Deathworlders." His words struck a chord. Though not everyone agreed, enough support emerged to formalize the alliance. Treaties were drafted, outlining shared responsibilities and mutual protection. It wasn't perfect, tensions remained, and trust would take years to fully solidify. But it was a start. Meanwhile, aboard the flagship, preparations continued. Scientists worked tirelessly to improve the prototype device, ensuring it could be mass-produced for future battles. Engineers designed hybrid ships combining human and Deathworlder tech, creating vessels capable of adapting to any threat. Warriors trained together, learning from each other's strengths, and forging bonds that transcended language and biology. As days turned into weeks, Ilara found herself reflecting on how far they'd come. From the initial signal that sparked panic to the devastating betrayal of Kale, every step had been fraught with uncertainty. Yet through it all, humanity had persevered, not alone, but alongside those who understood the cost of survival better than anyone. One evening, as she stood on the observation deck watching the stars, Zirak joined her once more. "Do you think we can win?" she asked quietly. Zirak hesitated before answering. "Winning may not mean defeating the Vorax completely. It may mean enduring together. As long as we stand united, they cannot extinguish us." Ilara smiled faintly, feeling a glimmer of optimism she hadn't felt in months. "Then let's make sure they never do." Together, they watched the galaxy stretch endlessly before them. A vast expanse filled with danger, yes, but also possibility. Humanity and the Deathworlders had taken their first steps toward coexistence, bound by the shared goal of protecting life in all its forms. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, it felt like a road worth traveling. And so, under the same sky, two vastly different species vowed to face whatever came next, not as strangers, but as allies united by hope. The dawn of a new era had begun, shining brightly against the shadows of the cosmos.